Ever feel like your body is staging, I don't know, a mysterious rebellion?
Hmm.
Maybe a simple cold just hangs on forever. Or you're suddenly hit with this, like, crushing fatigue or joint pain that feels like it came from absolutely nowhere.
Yeah.
That's kind of the unsettling reality of navigating autoimmune flares. And it can dramatically impact your quality of life.
It really can. It truly feels like your own system just turns against you. We're talking about conditions where the body's, incredible defense network,
Right.
the one built to protect you, mistakenly targets its own healthy tissues.
It's such a complex puzzle. And today, we're taking a deep dive into that world, the world of autoimmune flares.
Hmm.
We've got a stack of your sources guiding us here, everything from a practical guide on managing flares
Yeah, really useful stuff.
to a broad overview of autoimmune diseases, a closer look at systemic lupus erythematosus, or SLE,
Right.
and insights into the critical role of specialists in that whole tangled web of genetics and environment.
And our mission with this deep dive, really, is to help you not just learn the facts, but truly unpack what autoimmune flares are.
Okay.
How you can become a bit of a detective in spotting them, understand the, well, surprisingly complex tapestry of their causes,
Yeah.
explore the cutting edge of how they're managed today, and then take that closer look at lupus as, a prime example of how all these pieces fit together.
It's really about empowering you with understanding because, as one source puts it, being informed really does help you feel more in control.
Definitely.
And to start, we absolutely need to make a crucial distinction that the sources highlight right away.
Huh.
The difference between those ongoing chronic symptoms you might live with day to day.
The background noise.
Exactly. And the sudden, more intense surges known as flares.
Think of those chronic symptoms as, like you said, the constant background hum, maybe that low-level pain or fatigue that's just sort of always there.
Right.
Flares, they're like a sudden, unpredictable thunderstorm rolling in, completely different feel.
And
They are distinct periods of significantly heightened disease activity and inflammation, a real sharp departure from that persistent background noise.
okay, let's truly unpack this rebellion then. What exactly are autoimmune diseases at their core? How does the body get so, well, confused?
At its most fundamental level, it's a profound error in the adaptive immune system. That's the part that learns.
Okay.
So instead of solely recognizing and attacking foreign invaders like bacteria or viruses, it mistakenly identifies parts of the body itself, your own cells, your own tissues, as threats, and it launches an attack.
Wow.
This internal battle can target, well, virtually any body part. And research has identified over 80, potentially even more than 100 distinct autoimmune conditions.
Over 100,
Right.
that's staggering. And there's a related term I saw, autoinflammatory. What's the distinction there? Is it important?
It is a useful distinction, yeah. It's about which part of the immune system is primarily involved. Think of the adaptive system that's for autoimmune diseases like a highly trained special forces team.
Right.
It learns specific targets, like a particular virus, develops a long-term memory,
Okay.
and creates those autoantibodies, the ones mistakenly targeting self. The innate system involved in autoinflammatory conditions is more like the immediate police response.
Oh,
It
right.
reacts quickly to general signs of trouble or damage signals, but it doesn't develop that same specific memory or create those autoantibodies. Both cause inflammation, definitely, but the trigger and the mechanism differ slightly.
That's actually a really helpful way to think about it. So these flares, these unpredictable thunderstorms, what do they actually feel like? How would you recognize one in yourself?
Recognizing a flare is absolutely key, but, it's tricky because the symptoms are incredibly diverse. It really depends on the specific condition and which tissues are being attacked at that moment. But across the sources, common themes definitely emerge about how people experience them.
Okay, give us some of those examples the sources mentioned. What should people look out for?
Increased joint pain is a classic one. People describe it with really vivid language, feeling on fire or like their joints are caught in a vice.
Ooh.
Yeah. Significant inflammation, muscle weakness, that sensation your body is suddenly, made of jelly.
Wow.
And particularly profound fatigue are also very frequently reported.
And fatigue is highlighted as just incredibly debilitating, isn't it?
It really is. One survey cited found that nearly everyone with an autoimmune disease experienced fatigue, and over half considered it their most debilitating symptom, more than pain sometimes.
That's huge.
Yeah. Other signs can include things like a persistent low-grade fever, a general feeling of just being unwell or malaise, new or worsening skin rashes, and just generalized pain.
So this is really where you, the listener, have to become the Sherlock Holmes of your own body.
Precisely. Personal observation isn't just helpful, it's absolutely crucial. Keeping track of your symptom patterns, their severity when they occur, tracking it over time, that's vital intel. It helps you understand the unique language your specific condition speaks, and importantly, it helps you start to identify your potential personal triggers. You're basically gathering the essential clues for yourself and for your medical team.
Speaking of clues, the sources talk about flares often having these uninvited guests triggers. It's not always totally random, is it?
That's exactly right. While flares often feel completely unpredictable, they frequently have underlying triggers that kind of tip the system over the edge into high alert.
Like what? What are the common ones?
Stress is a huge factor, a really major one. It can flood the body with inflammatory hormones that just exacerbate that autoimmune activity.
Okay, stress. Makes sense. And infections seem to be a big one too.
Absolutely. Infections are really common culprits. They can directly cause inflammation, sure, but sometimes the immune response to an infection accidentally triggers a flare through a process called molecular mimicry.
Molecular mimicry. Okay, that sounds intriguing. What is that?
It is pretty fascinating. It's where a component of the invading microbe, a piece of a virus or bacteria, looks just similar enough to a protein or molecule in your own body that when your immune system gears up to attack the microbe, it gets confused. It basically starts attacking your own healthy tissue, too, because it looks so similar.
Wow. So like friendly fire.
Exactly like friendly fire. The sources mention examples like strep bacteria potentially triggering rheumatic fever and known links between Epstein-Barr virus, that's the monovirus, and conditions like MS and lupus. And even recent infections, like SARS-CoV-2, have been shown to potentially increase the risk of developing new autoimmune conditions later on.
That's worrying. Beyond stress and infections, what other uninvited guests are mentioned as triggers?
Well, some people report weather changes as potential triggers. The exact mechanism there is still being explored, maybe linked to subtle environmental shifts influencing autoantibodies somehow. Broader environmental factors are also implicated. Exposure to certain chemicals, things like hydrazines found in some dyes, pesticides, hazardous wastes, industrial emissions.
Yeah.
UV radiation is a really well-known trigger, particularly for conditions like lupus and dermatomyositis. It can cause specific skin flares.
Right, sunlight.
Yeah. And diet, plus disruptions to the gut microbiome, the balance of bacteria in your gut, sometimes called gut dysbiosis, those are also active areas of research as potential triggers or contributors.
Okay, so you're experiencing these strange symptoms, maybe you're even suspecting flares. How do doctors begin to unravel this mystery? The diagnostic journey sounds like quite the detective story itself.
It absolutely is a complex investigation. Autoimmune disorders are often called elusive or the great imitators.
I've heard that.
Because their symptoms overlap significantly with so many other illnesses, infections, other inflammatory conditions, even some cancers. Plus, symptoms can be transient, right? They come and go, making it harder to catch them in action. That's why the diagnostic process has to be so thorough.
So where does the medical detective work usually begin?
It really starts with gathering all the clues. The foundation is a deep dive into your medical history. Think of it as the case file.
Okay.
This includes looking at past unexplained issues that might suddenly seem relevant, a detailed family history of autoimmune diseases because of that genetic link we'll talk about,
Right.
potential environmental exposures you might have had maybe through work or where you live, and then a comprehensive physical examination where the doctor is looking for any outward signs of inflammation or organ involvement.
And then you move to the lab, running the tests to see what's actually happening inside the body.
Exactly. Laboratory tests are crucial for peering inside. Blood tests, in particular, are looking for specific markers, and autoantibody testing is one of the most pivotal steps here.
Okay, those antibodies mistakenly attacking self.
Precisely. Doctors are looking for their presence in your blood. They act almost like fingerprints for certain conditions.
Can you give us some examples of those key autoantibodies doctors look for? What are they called?
Sure. The sources list several. There's rheumatoid factor for rheumatoid arthritis, antiphospholipid antibodies, which are linked to clotting issues, and interestingly, they can even cause a false positive test for syphilis.
Really?
Yeah. Glutamic acid decarboxylase antibodies for type 1 diabetes. And for lupus specifically, antibodies called anti-double-stranded DNA or anti-dsDNA and anti-Smith antibodies are considered highly specific markers. Finding those is a big clue for SLE.
And what about the anti-nuclear antibody test, the ANA? That one seems to come up a lot.
The ANA test is very common, and it's highly sensitive. That means if you do have an autoimmune disease, especially something like lupus, there's a high chance your ANA will be positive.
Okay.
But, and this is the crucial point, this was to emphasize, it's not specific.
Wow.
A positive ANA is a significant clue, definitely. It's like spotting a suspect's car color, maybe, but it's not definitive proof. It can be positive in other conditions, even sometimes in perfectly healthy individuals, especially at lower levels. It basically tells the doctor to keep investigating, but it's not enough for a diagnosis on its own.
Okay, so autoantibodies are key clues, but not the whole story. What other lab tests are part of this investigation?
Doctors also look at general inflammation markers. Tests like C-reactive protein or CRP and erythrocyte sedimentation rate, ESR, these basically measure how much inflammation is broadly present in the body.
Like a general alarm bell.
Sort of, yeah. A complete blood count, or CBC, provides information about your red cells, white cells, platelets, all of which can be affected. And then depending on which organs they suspect might be involved, they'll run organ-specific tests like thyroid function tests or, say, intestinal biopsies if they suspect celiac disease.
And timing matters with these tests, right? It's not always a one-and-done kind of thing.
That's a really important point, yes. Some autoantibody levels can fluctuate over time, so tests might need repeating. Sometimes a condition needs to progress a bit before certain markers become detectable in the blood. It can be frustrating, but it's part of the process sometimes.
Are there any exciting new tools helping the medical detectives in this? Anything coming down the pike?
Yeah, research is always advancing the toolkit, thankfully. The sources mention promising newer approaches like something called the multi-analyte panel, or MAP, with cell-bound complement activation products, CBC caps for short.
Okay, bit of a mouthful.
It is, but why it's interesting for you, the listener, is because studies suggest this specific test shows improved diagnostic accuracy, particularly for SLE, which, as we said, is notoriously difficult to pin down compared to just using the traditional ANA testing alone. It could potentially speed up diagnosis for some people.
That's really good news. Beyond blood work, is imaging or taking actual tissue samples part of the process sometimes?
Absolutely. Imaging techniques like X-rays, CT scans, MRIs, they can assess if there's damage happening to internal organs like the lungs or the brain.
Okay.
And tissue biopsies are sometimes necessary. That involves taking a small sample, say a skin biopsy for a specific rash seen in a type of lupus called discoid lupus, or an intestinal biopsy for celiac disease to look at the tissue directly under a microscope for characteristic changes.
So the doctors are really piecing together this complex puzzle from your history, the exam, the blood tests, imaging, all while ruling out everything else it could be.
Precisely. That whole process of considering and systematically eliminating other potential causes, things like infections or genetic disorders, even malignancies, that's called differential diagnosis.
Right.
It's a critical step because the symptoms can look so similar. And often, because these conditions can affect multiple body systems, it really requires a multidisciplinary approach. You might see several specialists who collaborate, like a team of expert detectives, to interpret all the complex findings and arrive at the most accurate diagnosis.
It really hammers home that it's rarely a single, simple cause for these conditions.
That's one of the clearest messages coming through from all the sources. The exact causes of autoimmune diseases are still being actively researched, but it's almost certainly multifactorial, a really complex brew of different elements coming together.
And genetics is definitely one of those key elements, right?
Oh, for sure. There's compelling evidence for a genetic component. You see it clearly in what's called familial aggregation. These conditions often tend to run in families.
So if a close relative has one,
Your risk might be higher, yes. It doesn't guarantee you'll get it, but the risk is elevated compared to the general population.
and twin studies seem to make that point particularly strongly, don't they?
They really do. Studies comparing identical twins who share 100% of their genes to fraternal twins who share about 50%, like any siblings, show significantly higher concordance rates in identical twins. So if one identical twin has a disease like, say, multiple sclerosis or type 1 diabetes, the other twin is far more likely to also develop it than if they were fraternal twins. That difference strongly points to a significant genetic influence.
So are there specific risk genes that scientists have found?
Yes, absolutely. Through large-scale studies, particularly genome-wide association studies, or GWAS, which basically scan millions of genetic markers across thousands of people, researchers have identified specific genes and common variations within those genes technical term is polymorphisms that increase susceptibility or risk for certain autoimmune diseases.
And is there overlap between the genes for different autoimmune diseases? Like if you have a gene for one, are you more likely to get another?
That's one of the really fascinating insights, actually. Yes.
Hmm.
It seems many seemingly distinct autoimmune diseases actually share a common set of susceptibility genes.
Hmm.
This suggests that there are some fundamental underlying biological pathways involved in immune regulation that, when disrupted by certain genetic changes, can predispose you to a whole range of autoimmune issues, not just one specific disease.
Interesting.
There's even research hinting at shared genetic links between certain autoimmune diseases and some types of cancers, possibly pointing to, dysregulation in basic cell processes being a common factor.
That raises kind of an intriguing question.
Right.
Why would our evolution leave us with genes that carry this kind of risk? It seems counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? It's an interesting hypothesis related to an evolutionary balancing act. The idea is that some genes that were selected over millennia because they provided really strong protection against infections.
Right, which were a huge threat.
Exactly, a major killer throughout human history. Those same genes might, as an unintended consequence, also increase the risk of developing an overactive immune response against the self. It might have been a trade-off that favored immediate survival against external threats back then.
So the idea is genes might load the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. Is that fair?
That's a very common and useful way to think about it, yeah.
Yeah.
And the sources suggest that up to 70%, maybe even more of the risk, might actually be environmental.
70%. Wow.
It's a huge proportion. And we've already touched on some of these potential trigger pullers. Infections are a big one, certain chemical exposures, UV radiation, diet, and the health of your gut microbiome. All these environmental factors seem to play a role.
And the truly complex picture then is how the genes and the environment actually interact. It's not one or the other.
This is really where much of the cutting-edge research is focused now. It's not just having certain genes or being exposed to certain environmental factors. It's how your unique genetic blueprint responds to those environmental exposures.
Right.
So the same exposure might lead to an autoimmune disease in someone with one genetic background, but have no effect on someone with a different genetic makeup.
Okay.
Or conversely, different environmental exposures could potentially lead to the same condition in people who share similar genetic predispositions. Understanding this intricate dance between genes and environment is absolutely key to unlocking future prevention strategies and maybe even more personalized treatments.
And we definitely can't talk about causes without addressing that really striking gender difference. It keeps coming up.
Absolutely not. You really can't ignore it. It's a defining feature of most autoimmune diseases. Women make up a hugely disproportionate number of patients, around 80% overall, according to the sources.
80%.
Yeah. And for specific conditions like lupus, that ratio can be as high as 9 women for every 1 man affected.
It's just incredible. What are the theories behind that huge disparity? Why women?
There's no single simple answer yet, but hormonal factors are very strongly suspected.
Okay.
You see patterns where conditions often flare during periods of high hormone levels, like pregnancy, and sometimes they improve after menopause when hormone levels drop. The way estrogen and androgen hormones are processed in the body seems to play a role in regulating the immune system.
I see.
While some have suggested underreporting in men might contribute slightly, it really doesn't come close to explaining that vast difference. Hormones seem key.
And ultimately, it all comes back to that core failure of the immune system, that inability to recognize its own body as self.
That's the central issue, the breakdown of what immunologists call self-tolerance. The immune system fundamentally loses its ability to differentiate between the body's own host cells and potentially harmful foreign invaders.
Right.
And we mentioned molecular mimicry earlier as one potential mechanism for how this confusion can happen, where the immune system's response to a pathogen mistakenly targets similar-looking self-molecules.
Okay, so the picture of why this happens is definitely complex, a real mix of factors. Once someone is diagnosed and they understand they're dealing with an autoimmune condition and these flares, how is it managed? What tools are available to, calm that rebellion?
Yeah, moving into management, it's really important to start by stating clearly that for most autoimmune diseases, there isn't currently a definitive cure. That's the tough reality.
Okay.
So the focus of treatment is really on effectively managing the symptoms, reducing the underlying disease activity to prevent long-term organ damage, and significantly reducing the frequency and severity of those debilitating flares.
What do modern treatment approaches generally look like? What's in the toolbox?
Medications are definitely a cornerstone of management for most people. These range quite a bit. You have nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs like ibuprofen for more immediate pain and inflammation relief.
Right, common stuff.
Yeah. Then there are corticosteroids like prednisone. These are very powerful inflammation suppressors, but because of potential side effects with long-term use, they're often used more short-term to get a flare under control, or at the lowest possible dose for maintenance.
Okay.
And then there's a really important category called disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs, or DMARDs.
DMARDs. That sounds like a big category, right? What do they do?
They are a broad category, yes. They include older, well-established drugs like hydroxychloroquine, which is often used for lupus methotrexate, azathioprine, cyclophosphamide, mycophenolate. These work in various ways to dampen down different parts of the overactive immune response that are driving the disease process.
So they go beyond just symptom relief.
Exactly. They aim to modify the course of the disease itself. And there are also newer, more targeted therapies emerging, biologics, for example. Belimumab was mentioned in the sources. That was the first new drug specifically approved for SLE in decades, back in 2011. That represented a significant step forward in targeted treatment.
It sounds like many of these medications, especially the DRs and biologics, work by suppressing the immune system to some degree.
Yeah.
How do doctors balance controlling the disease with the risk of, well, making someone more vulnerable to infections? That seems like a tricky line to walk.
It is perhaps one of the most critical balancing acts in managing autoimmune diseases day to day. Doctors have to very carefully calibrate the level of immunosuppression.
Right.
They need to reduce the overactive autoimmune response just enough to calm the disease down, control the flares, prevent damage, but ideally leave enough immune function intact so the body can still fight off everyday viruses and bacteria effectively.
Because infections are a real risk.
Infections are a significant risk for people on many of these medications, yes. And doctors also have to constantly monitor for other potential side effects, things like liver damage with some DMARDs, or maybe increased heart risk associated with long-term steroid use. It requires really close monitoring and regular checkups.
Are there other medical treatments used beyond these kinds of drugs?
Yes, absolutely. Management is often multifaceted. It can involve other approaches like physical therapy, which is crucial for maintaining mobility and strength, especially when joints or muscles are significantly affected.
Okay.
Supplementation might be needed for specific deficiencies caused by the condition itself or its treatment. Common examples are insulin for type 1 diabetes or thyroid hormone replacement for Hashimoto's thyroiditis.
Right.
In some severe cases, things like blood transfusions might be necessary if there's severe anemia. And another treatment sometimes used is intravenous immunoglobulins, or IVGs.
IVs.
Huh?
What do they do? The sources mentioned their mechanism isn't fully understood.
That's right. The exact way IVB works isn't completely clear, but there are theories. One idea is they might interfere with the production or the function of those harmful autoantibodies. Or maybe they help the body clear out inflammatory complexes more efficiently. What's notable is that they don't seem to broadly suppress the immune system in the same way as some of the other drugs, which could potentially make them a useful option when the risk of infection is a major concern. But they are complex and expensive treatments.
Okay, so beyond the purely medical interventions, what can people do in their daily lives? The sources suggest lifestyle plays a pretty big role here too.
Lifestyle factors aren't just supplementary. Honestly, they are fundamental tools that you have in your own hands for managing an autoimmune condition and influencing flares. Diet is definitely one area.
How so?
Focusing on anti-inflammatory foods, lots of fruits, vegetables, healthy fats like those in fish or olive oil seems beneficial for many. And also potentially identifying and then avoiding personal dietary triggers. For some people, that might be processed foods. For others, it might be gluten. If they notice those things consistently seem to exacerbate their symptoms, it's very individual.
But exercise sounds kind of counterintuitive when you're dealing with significant pain and fatigue, though.
It can absolutely feel that way, but regular moderate activity is actually incredibly beneficial when possible.
Really?
Yes, it helps reduce overall inflammation levels in the body, it improves cardiovascular health, boosts mental well-being, and it can even help manage stress. The absolute key, though, is listening carefully to your body, especially during a flare.
So not pushing through extreme pain.
Definitely not. Exercise might need to be significantly modified or reduced during those periods, maybe switching to gentle stretching or walking. But maintaining some level of activity when you feel up to it is generally very important for long-term health.
And stress and sleep, they keep coming up.
Absolutely crucial. We know stress is a major potential trigger for flares, so finding effective stress reduction techniques that work for you, whether that's mindfulness, yoga, spending time in nature, whatever, is vital.
Right.
And adequate quality sleep is non-negotiable. It allows the body time to rest and repair. Lack of sleep can worsen fatigue, increase inflammation, and basically just fuel the cycle of flares. Prioritizing good sleep hygiene is essential.
And of course, circling back to actively avoiding known personal triggers.
Yes, definitely. If you know, for example, that excessive sun exposure reliably triggers your lupus rash, then religiously using sunscreen, wearing protective clothing, avoiding peak sun hours becomes a critical part of your management plan. Same goes for minimizing exposure to specific chemicals if those have been identified as triggers for you through work or hobbies.
Finding a community, finding support must also be incredibly important when you're navigating all this.
Oh, it's incredibly important. You can't underestimate the power of connection. Support networks provide invaluable emotional and practical support. Feeling understood by others going through similar experiences is huge.
What kind of resources are out there?
There are numerous resources mentioned across the sources. Local and national patient organizations dedicated to specific conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, MS, lupus, vasculitis. They offer tailored information, resources, and support groups. Online communities were described almost like virtual coffee shops, places where people can share experiences, practical tips, encouragement, 247 really.
That's great.
And patient advocacy groups act like, as one source put it, superheroes fighting for justice, working on a larger scale to ensure the needs and rights of patients are heard and addressed in healthcare and policy. Finding your tribe makes a difference.
Let's maybe zoom in on one specific condition now. Systemic lupus erythematosus, or SLE. It seems like a really powerful example of pretty much everything we've been discussing.
Lupus is often considered a prototype disease for autoimmunity, partly because it involves such a widespread loss of immune tolerance and can overlap with symptoms of many other conditions.
Right.
And it's also famously called one of the great imitators because its symptoms are so incredibly varied from person to person and they can mimic so many other illnesses. This makes diagnosis notoriously difficult and sometimes significantly delayed.
And the word systemic tells you it affects the whole body, not just one part.
Exactly. Lupus is a chronic inflammatory disease that can potentially attack multiple organ systems throughout the body. The skin, the joints, the kidneys, the heart, lungs, blood cells, the nervous system, eyes, pretty much anywhere.
What are some of the key symptoms specifically associated with lupus that the sources really highlighted?
Well, the classic red butterfly rash across the cheeks and the bridge of the nose is a signature symptom for many, occurring in maybe 30 to 60% of cases.
Okay, the Miller rash.
Yes, the Miller rash. And as we said, avoiding UV light is absolutely critical because sunlight can trigger this rash and other skin lesions common in lupus. Joint pain and swelling are also very common.
And blood issues.
Yes, blood abnormalities are frequent. Anemia, low red blood cell count affects about half of patients. Low platelets or low white blood cells are also common. And lupus is strongly associated with something called antiphospholipid antibody syndrome.
Right, you mentioned that earlier with the clotting.
Exactly, which increases the risk of blood clots. And yes, that interesting quirk where it can cause a false positive syphilis test, which can obviously cause some confusion.
I bet. Sounds like it could have quite serious internal manifestations, too.
It really can. Kidney involvement, which is known as lupus nephritis, is one of the more serious complications. It can potentially lead to kidney failure if not controlled, and the risk seems to be higher in certain populations, like those of Black or Afro-Caribbean descent. The heart can be affected by inflammation of the sac around it or valves, and there's an increased risk of accelerated atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, which can be worsened by long-term steroid use, unfortunately.
Wow.
The lungs can develop inflammation of the lining called pleurisy, or even a rare condition called shrinking lung syndrome. And the nervous system involvement can be really wide-ranging, anything from headaches and cognitive issues, lupus fog, to seizures or even psychosis in severe cases, sometimes linked back to those antiphospholipid antibodies.
And fatigue.
And yes, that profound, often debilitating fatigue we discussed earlier is extremely common and a major complaint for people living with lupus. It's often linked to disease activity itself, but also pain, depression, poor sleep, lack of fitness, lack of support. It's complex.
Are there variations or different types of lupus besides this systemic form?
Yes, there are. Besides SLE, there's drug-induced lupus erythematosus. This is a distinct form triggered by certain medications. The good news here is the symptoms usually resolve once the offending drug is stopped.
Okay, that's important.
There's also childhood onset SLE, which often tends to be more severe than the adult onset form and is sometimes linked to rare single gene mutations. And neonatal lupus is a rare condition seen in newborns, caused by the mother's autoantibodies crossing the placenta during pregnancy. It usually causes temporary skin rashes or blood issues, but sometimes, more seriously, can cause a permanent heart conduction block in the baby.
You mentioned epidemiology earlier. Does lupus show those same kind of gender and population disparities we talked about?
Yes, it does, very clearly. The global prevalence varies, but lupus rates are significantly higher in women. That striking 9-to-1 ratio is often cited.
Yeah.
And rates are also notably higher in populations of non-European descent, particularly those of Afro-Caribbean, Hispanic, Asian, and Native American descent compared to Caucasians. The reasons for these disparities are complex and likely involve genetic and socioeconomic factors.
The name lupus itself sounds a bit wolf-like. Where does that actually come from? Is there a story there?
It does sound dramatic, doesn't it? Lupus is Latin for wolf. The name likely originated way back in the 13th century. The prevailing theory is that it possibly referred to the facial rash, the butterfly rash, which someone thought resembled the bite of a wolf.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah, and the history of understanding lupus itself is a great illustration of how medical understanding evolves over time. For centuries, it was seen purely as a skin disease. It wasn't until physicians like Pierre Cazenave in France and later Sir William Osler in the late 19th century really recognized its systemic nature, that it affected the whole body.
And when did the understanding of autoimmunity really kick in for lupus specifically?
A major turning point was the discovery of the LE cell, lupus erythematosus cell, in 1948 by Hargraves and colleagues. This was really the first direct evidence of an autoantibody attacking the body's own cellular components.
Wow, okay.
This discovery led directly to the development of the ANA test and other autoantibody tests, and it really solidified the concept of autoimmunity being the root cause of lupus. That paved the way for the diagnostic criteria we use today and modern treatment approaches.
And thankfully, the prognosis, the outlook for people with lupus, has improved dramatically since those early days, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Medical advancements, particularly in diagnosis and treatment over the last 50, 60 years, have vastly improved life expectancy and quality of life compared to the 19th or even mid-20th century. It's still a serious condition, but management is much better. And just to put a human face on it, as the sources sometimes mention, many well-known people have lived and thrived with lupus athletes like Shannon Box, musicians like Tony Braxton and Seal, public figures like Nick Cannon, Selena Gomez. It helps raise awareness.
It definitely does make it feel more real and less isolating, perhaps.
Yeah.
So for everyone listening who might be experiencing persistent or unusual symptoms, when should they consider consulting a specialist, like a rheumatologist? What's the trigger point for that?
A rheumatologist is truly the expert guide for navigating these complex conditions. They are internal medicine doctors who've done additional, highly specialized training specifically in inflammatory and rheumatic diseases, those conditions affecting joints, muscles, bones, and the body's connective tissues.
So why go specifically to a rheumatologist versus, say, a general practitioner?
You should definitely consider seeing one if you suspect a rheumatic disease might be going on, especially if your symptoms involve multiple joints or tissues, if you have significant soreness, stiffness, or swelling that isn't easily explained, or if your symptoms come with systemic signs like unexplained fever, persistent profound fatigue, or rashes.
Okay.
Also, if symptoms are complex or if they seem to be worsening quickly, it's important to get a specialist opinion. These conditions can be progressive and potentially cause permanent damage if they're not diagnosed and managed effectively early on. And of course, having a family history of rheumatic disease is another strong reason to seek their expertise if you develop concerning symptoms.
What can someone expect during that first visit? What's the process like?
You can expect them to act very much like that lead detective we talked about earlier. They'll perform a detailed physical exam, really focusing on your musculoskeletal system, but also looking at your overall health for clues. They'll likely order comprehensive laboratory tests, including those specific autoantibody panels if indicated. They might order imaging like X-rays or ultrasounds or occasionally biopsies, and they'll take a very thorough medical history and family history.
Okay.
They use a multidisciplinary approach to treatment, figuring out the right combination of medications, maybe referring you for physical therapy, sometimes giving joint injections, and coordinating care with other specialists if other organs are involved. And because these conditions are typically chronic and can change over time, ongoing monitoring and follow-up visits with your rheumatologist are essential.
Any final practical tips for preparing for that initial rheumatologist visit? It sounds like it could be a bit overwhelming.
The sources offer some really good practical advice. First, try to organize any existing medical records you have that might be relevant. Jot down your detailed medical history, including past illnesses or surgeries, and make a clear list of all medications and supplements you're currently taking.
Okay, good idea.
Crucially, keeping a symptom journal in the days or weeks leading up to the appointment can be incredibly helpful. Since symptoms often fluctuate, documenting when they occur, how severe they are, what makes them better or worse, and any potential triggers you've noticed that provides vital information the doctor can use to see the pattern.
That makes sense.
And finally, consider bringing someone along with you, a family member or friend, to help listen, maybe take notes and ask questions. It's often a lot of information to take in during that first big consultation.
This deep dive has really taken us on quite a journey, hasn't it? From understanding that fundamental concept of the immune system's mistaken rebellion, autoimmune diseases and their flares,
Yeah.
to identifying those potential uninvited guests or triggers, navigating the often complex diagnostic detective work.
Appreciating the really multifaceted causes woven together from genes and environment, exploring the practical tools for managing flares, and then taking that closer look at lupus as such a powerful example of it all.
It's definitely clear that living with or even just understanding autoimmune conditions is an ongoing process. It's not simple.
Mm.
But hopefully you, our listeners, now have a deeper understanding of the landscape.
Yeah.
You have tools now recognizing those flare thunderstorms when they roll in, understanding the potential triggers behind them, knowing the importance of working closely with dedicated healthcare professionals, utilizing those support systems we talked about, and leveraging crucial lifestyle factors as real tools for gaining a sense of control. And remembering you are absolutely not alone on this journey.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe just take a moment to consider how incredibly delicate that balance is within our own immune system. It has to be constantly vigilant against external threats, viruses, bacteria, yet it needs absolute precision to know when not to attack our own cells.
Such a fine line. It really is. How does this astonishingly complex system sometimes lose its way? And what more might we uncover in the future about that intricate dance between our genetic code and the world we live in, the environment? New research, whether it's developing even more targeted immunotherapies or peeling back more layers of those gene-environment interactions, offers truly fascinating possibilities for better understanding and hopefully better managing these conditions down the road.